So since it's round two, we can just start a conversation and we don't have to worry about like the formal intros.
Okay. Well, you are the expert, so I will follow your lead.
So if anyone who is not familiar with you, to get the full origin story, I have the episode number handy, but it's June 2021, episode 264, June in 2021, to get the full story of Alban. But thank you for coming back for round two on the podcast Junkies.
Yeah, Harry, thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be back on the show.
It's a bummer that we don't get to hang out at the conferences. And sometimes I haven't been to, the last one I was at was Denver for Podcast Movement, which was last year. And then, so I haven't been making it to the evolutions, and there's like a lot going on in my world with like, we're now relocated to Minnesota. So last time in 2021, I was in Minneapolis, but it wasn't where we're at now. And it looks like you're in a different location as well.
My location's quite a bit closer. I used to be in the bedroom that's one that way.
Yeah.
So I've moved a whole room in our house, but I located over here because the lighting's better and I can look outside and there's trees and birds rather than just a wall.
Remind me where home again is for you?
Jacksonville Beach, Florida.
Okay. And what's the weather been like there lately?
I went and ran this morning at 6:45 and it was enough that like you're just pouring in sweat. So it's hot, it's humid. It's only going to get more so. We'll hit the hundreds in June, July, August. So it'll be nice and toasty.
We're just now getting into 60s and 70s. And I think for anyone who's been following a couple of the posts I've been making on socials, it's been a bit of a change here because we're now into kind of like the homesteading vibe, and we're about 30 minutes outside Minneapolis. So there's about an acre of land, and we're looking to like, we've got not crops, but just like veggies. We're planting like garden beds. We're roping off an area because we want to keep the deer away, because there's deer and rabbits and squirrels and all sorts of critters and turkeys that come on this property. We're in the process today of building a chicken coop because we've got 5 chicks in the house in a brooder. So it's a lot happening.
That's awesome. You were, for a long time, you were the vertical farming guy in my brain.
Yes.
And now I'm going to think of you as the homesteader. Harry Duran, many different shapes.
Well, it's so funny because the Vertical Farming Podcast is still going strong, 120 plus episodes. And that I went to a Vertical Farming Conference earlier this year in Vegas. And then there's another one in Chicago. So it's interesting how it's just kind of like taken on a life of its own. And we've merged with a newsletter called I Grow News. And so it's like another second or third business to run at this point. So I kind of lose track of all the stuff that it's all within the realm of podcasting and because of podcasting. But it's been interesting to kind of keep my ear because of Podcast Junkies, which is 10 years in April of this year was the 10-year anniversary for this show. So it's been crazy to think about the fact that I've been doing it.
That is wild. 10 years of podcasting for me will be this December.
Oh, nice.
That's when I quit my job as a lawyer to go work for 3 other guys in a tiny little room. And I was like, I love podcasting. And they're like, yeah, we have a podcasting product. Come over here and work on it.
That's nice.
And it ended up working out really, really well for us.
So I keep on top of what's happening mainly because of Sam and James with Podnews. And I know you guys are supporting them as well with the daily show and the weekly show as well.
Yeah, we love the show. I was actually just listening to it this morning. Did you listen to the new one?
Not the new one yet, no.
So a few episodes ago, I was on there to talk about our iOS app, and we finally launched a iOS app for Buzzsprout. For years, people had told us, we'd love for you to have an iOS app. And we were kind of like, that doesn't really make a ton of sense to us. And over the years, we get convinced and we hear all these use cases and we start thinking of some ourselves. And so we launched an iOS app, and today we are launching something else we're calling Fan Mail. And it's one of these, like, for us, really exciting features that make so much more sense when we already have an iOS app.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a ton of fun now seeing kind of the synergy between having this app on our phones and having Fan Mail, which is the best way for listeners to contact the host of their favorite podcasts.
Oh, wow. So let's start with the iOS app, because I think for folks that maybe missed that conversation, or if you didn't go in depth as you kind of would have liked to, I think about, obviously you think about Buzzsprout as a podcast host, and you think about the functionality that you need as a podcast host for what you do on a daily basis, get your show uploaded. And I'm thinking, like, before you get into it, like the reasons I would get value from an iOS app, and it's obviously stats, access to like changes on the fly. So I'm curious, like, when you guys were thinking about coming up with that, is it users requesting it, or is just kind of a combination of like some research and development on your end?
I mean, it's all of it. We go to conferences and we have people mention what they'd like. People like you that would say those two, stats and changes on the fly. And one of the most important things to us is we do Buzzcast. It's a show about the industry specifically for people on Buzzsprout or people who are independent podcasters.
Yeah.
And by doing that show now for 6-7 years, we've, are using our own product day in, day out. And we would feel these moments where you'd want to log in on your phone. And we had invested a lot in our mobile experience, so if you went to the mobile website, but it's nice to stay logged in and make sure that when you click, the app, that you're logged in right away. You don't have to go into the browser.
Yeah.
And it's really nice if you want to check your stats to have a really clean stats view that's made for your phone. Or like you said, the changes on the fly one, we published an episode and I didn't title it. And when I saw the title went live, I was like, oh, I don't like that title at all. I want to change it. Well, now I've got I'm listening in the car, so I need to wait till I get into the office to go on my computer to change it.
Yeah.
And you just hit those little roadblocks and you go, it'd be really nice is you just pull out your phone and you make a change right there. You click save and your podcast has been updated. So if you ever make a typo or you've missed a link or somebody else titled it and you didn't love it, you just make that change right away.
Are those the cases where you see folks using it more? And is there an Android app as well?
Android's on the way. So it's pretty close. Right now we're testing it. It works, but we want to make sure it's really polished the same way that we did with the iOS version.
So when you look at stats, right, and, I've tried a lot of different hosting companies as well, and over the years, and I think one of the things we hear a lot from podcasters is the metrics to see the trends are good. And I think the question is always like, what should podcasters be looking at in terms of actionable trends? Like when you look at a stat, and it's probably something that's near and dear to me, because when I was in my previous corporate life, I used to manage a customer service reporting team. So it was like 9 people, and all they did was like prepare reports just for the customer service department. So we would slice and dice, info so many different ways. And I would tell them, we would prepare like reports for VPs, right? So I would say to the team, hey, I know you spent like 2 hours on this report. It looks really beautiful and polished, but they're going to look at it for 30 seconds and they're going to say like, what do I need to be worried about, or what do they need to be concerned about here? So I'm curious if there's any guidance you provide like your audience or your clients or your customers in terms of like how to look at the metrics in a way that's actionable.
That's actually the question that we were asking ourselves when we redid our stats. And I want to say we redid those in 2014. So almost 10 years ago is when we did the big revamp. And we started with, what can you actually learn from podcast stats that matters, that's actionable? Because I don't know if you've had this experience, you go into Google Analytics or you go into maybe some Facebook Analytics, and there's just so much.
It's so overwhelming.
And there's people that they enjoy it. It's fun to like make cool graphs and look at all these visualizations. But at the end of the day, we need to have a question that gets an answer from that data, and then that informs future decisions. So a few of the things that we looked at, we were like, okay, you want to see trends?
Yeah.
Are my episodes now getting more or less downloads than they were, a few episodes ago? And so we have these 7-day views, the 30-day views, where you can see all your episodes and how they're tracking. So you can see, okay, they're going up, so something's positive. We have daily views where you can go in and see kind of these charts with these spikes on individual days. And you go, okay, I see the spike on that Tuesday. Well, that's when I sent this big email blast out with the link to my episode. Good, the email blast is working. Like, you need to get that feedback. You can just over time see the cumulative view. And you go, oh, it's still continuing to grow. and the growth is accelerating, which means I now have more people listening. We pull in all the podcasting apps.
Yeah.
Well, what if you see, hey, Apple Podcast isn't showing up anymore? Maybe you notice your podcast was dropped by Apple Podcasts. Maybe you learn you never submitted to one of the top directories.
Yeah.
So we try to really be focused on, there's so many stats we could make up. You can slice the same data 400 ways.
Yeah.
But every stats page in Buzzsprout should be answering particular questions.
Yeah, I like to think about it in a way like in terms of actionable data or even trends or aberrations from trends. So if your podcast typically is, you're getting 150 downloads per episode, over the past 6 months, if one episode you're getting the 500, so it's like, if you think about your month over month increase, it's always steady or, 1 or 2%, or you look back or like a 3-month rolling average. I think that's sometimes a good measure. So if you're about 150 over the past 3 months, or even a 12-month rolling average, right? And then you see a spike or a drop, like it now is at 50, or it's at 600. It could be like an interesting way to deep dive into the metrics. And I wonder how much handholding you guys provide in terms of like seeing something to point to, because I think as podcasters, sometimes we're like, you see all the country metrics, you see all the like browser versus iOS versus like desktop metrics. And I think sometimes it's a bit overwhelming for folks to kind of figure out what is moving the needle. Because right, that's the ultimate question, right? Like, what can I change about my show to like to put those metrics, to move those metrics in the positive direction?
Yeah, as far as hand-holding, I mean, this is Tom's most popular talk he ever gives at Movement or Podfest. What are your stats telling you, and what can you do about it? What are the actionable metrics, and what matters? We respond to tons of these in support, but we've also made videos about like, all right, let's go look. And if you see this, let's talk through what that would mean.
Yeah.
Locations are fun, but it's cool to see, oh, this country's doing better than that country. But what's really interesting, one of my friends, he does a podcast about comic books and the whole comic book scene.
Yeah.
And so when they were traveling around Europe, they would stop by comic book stores and meet the owner and talk to him and say, hey, do you mind if we leave some business cards here that talk about the podcast? And so they left a bunch in Berlin, and then they leave a bunch they go around all these different places. And they said, to this day, they pull open their stats and there's little pockets in all of those cities. And this was 5-10 years ago that they were actually starting the show. But, the little seeds that they put out there, they got a few listeners from that one marketing tactic, and it worked. And it got validated. For them, that's really useful information, because now they know if we can ever create those relationships, let's do it. But if we were to look over for Buzzcast, my location stats say people in big cities, New York, LA, listen, and a lot of people in Jacksonville, Florida. Well, that's where we're located, so it makes sense. But I wouldn't get a ton of other information out of that. Maybe if we were doing a live recording, I would go, oh, we should probably do the live recording here in Jacksonville or in New York. But besides that, it's not going to be as actionable for us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other feature that I've heard used on the show is the dynamic ad insertion. So can you talk a little bit about that and what the thought is behind there? And if you're also looking to improve or add features to that as well, because obviously everyone's doing it a little bit differently now.
So dynamic content is a way for you to add any type of content into your show as a pre-roll, as a post-roll, or we're using AI to figure out the best spot inside of the show to insert content. So we're finding all those mid-rolls for you so you can be done as a mid-roll. And that content can be ads, and it can be ads that work through Buzzsprout ads. So maybe we source the ad for you and then we'll drop it in. But what's more powerful is if it's an ad that you sourced yourself. So for vertical farming, I remember going to your talk and you said, selling those ad spots and getting full sponsorships for the show is so much more valuable than the 2 cents an episode that you would have gotten with a CPM ad. And so dynamic content is focused on not the very biggest shows that will just do mass amounts of ads. We're more excited about when you find the perfect fit that you can add that in to all your episodes. But it doesn't just have to be ads. It doesn't have to be sponsorships. It could also be, hey, I'm going to be at Podcast Movement in a few months. I'd love to see you all there. Well, that'd be great to add into all of your episodes. And you can do that with dynamic content. You upload it and it gets added to all the episodes at once. So you're not going back and editing them one at a time.
So you can add it. If you choose the dynamic option, the AI will pick where to place it.
Yes. So what it will do is it'll find kind of an appropriate topic change. That's what we really would like to find. We're talking about one thing, changes to something else. The speakers change. There's a natural pause. And then we have a human voice come in and say, all right, let's take a quick break. And we got nice music rolling in. And then we have the content that you dropped in yourself. And then now back to the episode. And we go back into it. And that was just, we're podcast listening fans. You know, we've experienced the really bad ad that just cuts in mid-word.
Non-relevant, yeah.
Or the really bad ad that's 3 times as loud as the episode.
Yes. Yeah.
So we wanted to make something that at least would work for us, that when we heard it, we wouldn't cringe. We'd go, okay, I know it's an ad. Sometimes you don't want the ad, or maybe, but now it can be a piece of content that maybe you really, really would like to hear. Like, hey, Harry's going to be giving a talk at Podcast Movement. I'm going to be there. And the fact that I listen to Podcast Junkies, let me know about it.
Could you also do a dynamic ad that's placed in at a certain timestamp?
You're saying with dynamic content in the mid-roll sections?
Yeah.
So I think all those right now are going to be picked by AI. We don't have a selecting tool for you to go in and pick those.
Okay.
Our thinking for that is a pretty cumbersome process. So if you know exactly where you want it, then it's easy. But what's really not easy is I create an episode, I edit it, I put it live, and now I go, oh, I've got to pick my ad spots. And now what do? I listen to all of the episode? Or if I'm now going to add dynamic content into 50 or 200 back episodes, I'm going to listen to all of those and find a spot. Our hope is I guess our thinking is that's something computers are really good at. That's something people are not good at. And if it requires you to do 200 hours of re-listening to your old episodes and cringing and finding the right spots, then you're probably not going to do it. So that's why we made it to be an automated solution.
Yeah. We've been testing some stuff here where we have clients say, before we get into this uninterrupted conversation with Alban, here's a few words from our sponsors. So then that becomes a marker, and that's like a consistent place where we put it every time.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to do it. You can't upload that language to us so that it makes it real clear so you can be the one to say, all right, let's take a quick break, and then it can jump into the dynamic content.
So you can actually record the lead-in to your ad as well as the ad itself.
Exactly. It's nicer if it's you, because then it feels more natural. The ones that are not as good as when it's just a random person.
It feels like the AI is getting more and more powerful. It's pretty wild because we've been testing out a couple of tools. I know you had initially started with Podium. Are you still working with them? Are you doing something in-house or?
For
AI, just AI related support.
For co-host AI, we are still using Podium. That's still our partner. But for anyone who's listening, co-host, what it does is you upload your episode, we transcribe the whole thing, and then we use that to write suggested titles, descriptions, chapter markers, social posts, blog posts,
a
bunch of other things. And again, like this just comes from personal experience. After you've done the episode and then you've edited the episode, I never think while I'm editing or while I'm recording, what's a good title for this? And then you get to the end and you're uploading it to Buzzsprout and you go, oh, I need a title. I need all this stuff. I need to transcribe. And that becomes the chance for like my laziness to kick in. And I'm like, we're just calling it episode 86. We're moving on. But co-host could jump in. It gives me 5 suggestions. 2 of them are going to be good. And I go, oh, but now I remember exactly what this is like. And I'm going to pick a title that's a variation of one of them.
Yes.
And the description reminds me of all of the main points, and I might tweak it. And then the chapter markers, I'm like, oh, you found the right spots, but I think I want to name them slightly differently. And now I become the editor, not the person who has to re-listen to the entire 1 hour conversation to try to come up with that information.
And so you're placing it if you think about the UX, like the UI as you're uploading an episode. So as you're up in the place in Buzzsprout where you're uploading or have to type in the content, like that's where co-host appears and allows you to populate it right there in real time.
Exactly. So it's going to take us a little while to come up with all that. You upload it to us. We make sure it's the right file type. We make sure the loudness settings are correct. If you're using Magic Mastering, we're going to master the episode for you. We'll do all of that. And then we have to transcribe, and then we have to come up with that information. So it can take a little bit of time, but then you come back and you've got all those options for a title. You click one, and now it's in that box to edit if you want to edit it further. The description's already pulled into the description box, so you can tweak it if you'd like, or you can just publish it as is. And since we mentioned the iOS app in the beginning, this was, to me, one of the big drivers of why we need to have an app, because we were sending all these emails that were like, co-host is ready. And people don't get emails immediately. Most people don't, at least. But now I have an app on my phone that lets me know 10 minutes after I upload, hey, co-host is ready. And I go, oh, I pull it up, I make a couple tweaks, I click publish, and I'm done. I don't have to have been sitting at my computer refreshing the page kind of maniacally going, okay, when is this going to be ready? I can just get the notification and take that action right away.
That's nice. That's very convenient. Where else are you seeing opportunities for podcasters to leverage everything that's happening with AI? Because it's so overwhelming sometimes when you see like everything that's being done and people throwing like updates to like ChatGPT, Claude, and I got my hands full just with ChatGPT and everything, the cool things that you can do there. But it's interesting. And I'm wondering if you've gotten any feedback from the community or requests from the community about like other ways AI could start to like make a podcaster's life a little easier.
I am paying a lot of attention to it because I'm excited with the tools that we've built. I'm excited to see all the, these are like the two of the worlds that I'm most excited about, AI and podcasting.
Yeah.
There are some things that I'm seeing now that I pull away from pretty viscerally. So one of the examples is a lot of these synthetic voices where people are creating a fake voice and they don't sound exactly right yet. They're getting better.
They're close,
but they're not there all the way. And so I see podcasters kind of asking like, oh, could I kind of use this to make my voice and then I don't have to actually record? You can, but I think the future is going to be a world where AI is creating tons and tons of content, and it kind of like floods the internet with all sorts of text, all sorts of social content, all sorts of video and audio. But there's going to be little pockets where there's still going to be primarily people making content. And I really hope the way that podcasting kind of dodged the algorithm wave of social media by being platform agnostic and allowing people to move around between hosts and people connect directly to their audience. I hope that podcasting also is able to dodge a bit of the AI stuff. And I specifically mean that around you creating your own content, having an authentic conversation with somebody, using your own voice, and then just publishing that out to the world. I think those are the areas that people want the human to be there. And the other things like picking the right chapter marker and helping you write the description.
Yeah.
That doesn't feel like the integral human component. That feels kind of like any, person that you hired, you could ask them, hey, today, could you do this for me? And they go, sure, I could. Yeah, I could fill in. And that doesn't feel like that's the creativity. But if you were all of a sudden pulling some AI voice cloning in to do the whole episode for you, I'm like, well, why am I listening to podcast junkies if Harry's not even doing these interviews?
It's interesting because I've been testing Wondercraft as a tool that does something similar. But you can create a whole podcast episode, but we're testing it for like a secondary podcast on the vertical farming side. That's just news. It's just reading the news. It's almost like Podnews, weekly recap. And I think James tried it out too, and he was a bit like impressed, slightly disturbed, slightly worried that he's like, this actually is pretty good and it's getting there. And if it's just someone like tuning in for the news and not so like dialed into the personality, I could see how somehow like some of that might be helpful, because it's pretty wild. And we tested out a couple of instances of it, and you just drop in like a summary blog post and it'll like reinterpret it and like add commentary in a different voice. And there's one called Scarlett. It sounds like Scarlett Johansson. It's so funny. And you can add a British accent, and you can have her be like calm or excited. And so in initial tests, it's interesting because all this stuff is just going to keep getting better and better. So it feels like there's unique, very narrow use cases where it could be used. But I agree with you, like anything that takes away from what people come to podcasts for, if you've dialed in and you're hearing this personality that you've built a relationship over the years, I'm sure you don't want AI getting in the middle of that.
Yeah, I think the best way, at least the defining line for me about what's appropriate, what's not, is would I be comfortable saying, here's what I'm doing?
Yes.
And right now, like I do, if this tool existed, that I could type up 100 ideas for YouTube videos, and then a bunch of them would be generated and created about podcasting and posted for me. Like I'd be tempted to do that. But then I would go, I would feel like such a fraud if I did. And I would never want to tell people I did it. Well, that's probably a good indication that it's not a good idea. But I'm perfectly happy. I'm using it as a marketing pitch. Hey, come to Buzzsprout because we'll transcribe it for you. You don't have to transcribe it yourself. That doesn't feel wrong. It feels right. We'll come up with the chapter markers for you. That feels right. And I think that the news is probably on the that feels right side. No, Harry Duran didn't read this whole episode to you. It might have been a voice that sounded like it, but as long as you feel comfortable telling your audience, hey, the news happens every day. Some of you want to listen to this before I've even read these stories, so I've automated it. I think that's totally appropriate. The people who are kind of palming it off as their own work, and that's where it starts feeling a bit gross to me.
I think everyone's going to have to probably create an AI version of themselves. So like AI Alban and just have that like as AI Harry, and it's like, or yeah, I see some people like saying, hey, this is Harry bot, for some of these automated chat tools or something like that. They're actually like admitting like, hey, this is Harry bot subbing in for Harry to start this conversation. But if you need to speak to him at some point. So I'm sure they're finding creative ways. And to your point, as long as they're being open with it, that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about fan mail.
Yeah. So we're talking a little bit about AI and how machines get in the way. But the big thing we're all excited about is how do we connect people, specifically connecting podcasters with their audience. Now, podcasters reach their audience in a pretty obvious way. They create the podcast and then they send it out.
Yeah.
But for anyone who's podcasting for a long time, you can often just feel like, I don't even know if these numbers are real. I record every week, I put it out there, it goes out to the world, and the numbers go up, and then nothing. And then you do it again and again. You get one review on Apple Podcasts, and you go, okay, so somebody listened, but there's still not a ton happening.
Yeah.
And for our show, we tested everything. We tried Boostograms, we tried fan list, and we tried true fans, and we tried voicemails, and we tried email, we tried Twitter, then X, and then Discord. Like we tried so many solutions. And we were like, just talk to us about the show. And we would get interactions, but it was a lot of work and it just didn't feel like it was easy.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of this year, Kevin on our show goes, 2024, my resolution is we're going to figure this out.
And when you said figure it out, he meant grow the show?
No, he goes, we've got to figure out how our listeners will contact us. How will we get them to contact us in a easy way? It's easy enough for them that they're excited to do it.
Yeah.
And I go, we just got to have one way. It's got to be one. It's got to be like, just send us an email or like put Kevin's phone number in there and just say, text Kevin. And then the next episode I come on, I'm like, hey, so I have this texting solution that I signed up for. It's pretty expensive, but let's try it out. And you hear us, and all of a sudden we start getting tons of texts, that number. And quietly on the Buzzsprout side, we get really excited because we've tried every solution out there.
Yeah.
And then we tried this solution that everybody has used their whole lives, SMS. And as soon as we tried it, the numbers went way, way up.
Really?
So, I mean, just for as an example, we recorded a week ago and we said, hey, this feature's out there. Everybody just click the link. It opens up your texting app. You send something and that will come through to us. Since then, it's been a week. We've gotten 17 texts, and these are encouragements. These are feedback about the show. It's what they like, what they don't like.
Yeah.
And that's the feedback we were like dying for. 17 people, some of them texting multiple times. That's huge. If I was getting 5 of those, I'd be excited. And we're just getting tons.
So that's happening. So how does that work, like app-wise? So talk to me about the user experience if they're on the app. Is it still, so fan mail is now using this SMS service, or it's kind of like evolved into this?
So what fan mail is the Buzzsprout version.
Okay.
You go into Buzzsprout and you turn on fan mail. You can do that on the iOS app, or you could do that on desktop. And when you turn on fan mail, we will add a link to all of your show notes that say text the show. Now on the listener side, they're just listening to a podcast and Harry goes, hey, why don't you shoot me a text? Click the link in the show notes.
Okay.
They go, they click it, and it opens up their podcast or their texting app.
Okay.
And it's sending it to a number, and it's got a code in there so we know it's Podcast Junkies.
Yeah.
And they text whatever they want, and you will then get a notification on your iOS app. Then you will get an email that says you've got fan mail, and you'll log into your account. And when you log in, you've got this inbox of all the people who've reached out. We're doing, we're threading them together so you can kind of tell like, okay, this is all the same person. We don't give the full phone number because we want to keep them. We don't want to expose all this information that people didn't mean to expose. And you can block if anybody sends you something you don't like, or maybe you're getting political texts all of a sudden.
But you're acting as the intermediary. So if like those texts are coming to my personal number, if I hit like, I can hit stop to stop because normally with those messages, you can hit like stop if you want them to stop the messages or.
Yeah, these will never, you as the podcaster will not ever get any texts.
Okay. Oh, it's all through the app. Yeah.
Yeah, it would text into Buzzsprout. And so it'd show up inside of Buzzsprout on desktop or Buzzsprout in iOS.
That's great.
And so you'd be able to go through and read those. And the best way for you to respond, obviously, is then when you record the show, now you can go in and you can read them off and say, oh man, I got 5 really great pieces of fan mail this week. Let me thank the people who wrote in and read what your feedback was.
I always have these like marketing ideas when I hear cool stuff like this. So it's like you could build it into the app. Like once it comes in, if you like, oh, I want to share this on social right away, it could be like a 1 button click to like post this on my Twitter or post this on my Facebook page or something like that at some point in the future. That'd be cool. You can create a nice graphic around it.
I may or may not have already pitched this internally.
Great minds think alike. I love it.
Because with the app, this was so funny to me. What's the best? People look at their stats, they look at their achievements that we give them.
Yeah.
And we often would see people share them. But then when we release the app, one of the main things we want to do is make it easy to share to social. And it's so much more natural.
That's what everyone's looking to do. And solo podcasters are looking for so much help because they're wearing so many hats. So anything you can do that's like 1 button away, or just like have this kind of like dashboard in your hands of like control panel of like all the things I need to do. And it's just 1 button and just continuously gets the word out. And I think just pushing out these like people that are loving the show on socials, I think is really nice social proof.
Yeah. So you can screenshot stuff, click all these share buttons, go directly and to the social apps and send them out. But I love that idea that when you get these messages in that are, really excited about the show, they're expressing what they like, that you could 1 tap say, I want to share this and put it up on social. I think that's a wonderful idea.
And obviously, because it's coming from the podcast host, it's app agnostic. So whether you're listening in Spotify or Apple or Overcast, or I'm assuming you can listen in the podcast in your Buzzsprout app as well. Obviously it's the same experience, right?
Yeah, the Buzzsprout app that we built on iOS, that is just for the podcaster to do their own podcasting work. So you're managing your podcast, you're sharing things from there.
So more for the host.
It's for the podcast host.
Okay.
But all listening apps are going to be able to have people click links. And if they can click a link, then we can load up a message inside of their texting app. And now they're able to shoot a text. And I think, honestly, the reason that this is so much more popular than if you have to open up a random web page and record a voice message, or open up a crypto wallet and try to send some Bitcoin along with the message, is because we all know what texting is. And there's a lot of, muscle memory built into texting. We know it shouldn't be too long. We know how to keep it it's informal. We don't have to overthink the message. But if you tell me call in and do a 30-second voicemail for the show, I want to write it out. I want to think about it. I want to get my voice warmed up. I have so much to do. And then I go, I've got a lot going on in my life and I don't send anything. But if you say, shoot us a text and let us know what you think, it can be as short as, man, I really love the show. Thank you so much for doing it, Alban. And that takes 3 seconds of my day. And for the podcaster who may have never gotten a message in their life about the show, that could be a really, really big, exciting thing.
Because of the technology, and I guess maybe Apple obviously treats it differently. iMessage is different than SMS and stuff like that. But, because I know people leave voice messages on text as well. And there could be a point in the future where you could use that same mechanism to capture the voice messages as well. And as the technology improves or something allows you to do that.
I'm sorry, Harry, you cut out a little bit there. Could you say that again for me?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking how sometimes you can actually leave voice messages on text as well, right? Depending on the device, if it's Apple to Apple, you could record a quick message and it'll just show up as the audio file. And I wonder if at some point in the future, the technology will allow you to leverage what you're doing with fan mail, but also to leave a quick voice message as well.
The way we're doing it now is all just text-based.
Yeah.
That's what has really wide adoption across the entire world. People can send text. When you get into audio messages, I know there's different things between the way Android will handle it or Apple. So these are all things for us to work out. One of the things we're trying to work on right now is if you text internationally, that can cost a few cents. And it pretty quickly is, I'll send a message, but if it's a dime, there's a little bit of friction there versus somebody who has unlimited free texting in the US. So we're looking for solutions for that. But what's actually a little bit ironic is that because texting costs money, it actually is such a better medium for people to communicate, because the scammers and people who just send spam out all over the web, they'll just do it because it's totally free. They send 1 million messages. It costs them $2 and they go, no big deal. But as soon as you apply, this might cost you a penny, it might cost you 2 cents, then the spam drops off significantly because they're like, oh, that's a real amount of money. I don't want to just send out all the spam. So it's been a really nice thing that's come along with texting. We're not seeing spam come in. We're seeing it's pretty much all listeners of the podcast who are excited to connect finally with the host and say something kind about what they're doing.
So obviously this idea of feedback to the host, supporting the host, is something that's near and dear to every podcaster's heart. You did mention the sending crypto, so I'd be remiss if I didn't ask what the latest update is. Or I know a topic that's near and dear to Sam Sethi's heart is podcasting 2.0 and all the tags. And so I'm curious how you've been approaching that, because a lot has changed since we last spoke and there's a lot of movement happening. And you did mention TrueFans as well. So I'm curious where Buzzsprout is in terms of supporting that and what's been the experience with your users who have tried to use it.
We probably I wish I knew off the top of my head exactly how many tags, probably 12 of the new podcasting 2.0 tags. It's quite a few. But some of them, like transcripts, just made so much sense and now have been adopted by Apple. Some of them, like the person tag, which will let people know, hey, this is the person who's on the show, the host and the co-host. Location tags. So if your podcast is about a particular location, we will grab that information. At least the way I think about it, and I think I speak for the whole Buzzsprout team, is we don't want to add a ton of extra work for the podcaster until we see where that value will be for the podcaster.
Yeah.
So just blanket adding hundreds of tags into Buzzsprout as a whole would just add a bunch of extra weight for people to think about. But when we know you're already telling us the host name, well, let's add that into the tag so it's readily accessible by a podcast listening app. Then, we know that you're going to tell us about the location if that's the subject of the podcast. Well, we already collect that information, so let's display that. And that's the way we're thinking through it. One that is a little bit different that I really love, though, is Podroll. Have you looked at Podroll yet?
It's similar to Blogroll, right? Where you list like the shows that you recommend.
Yeah. So back in the good days of blogging, you'd go to a blog, you'd read something and you go, oh, this person's really smart. I love what they're doing. What do they read? What do they like?
Yeah.
And they'd have 4 or 5 things on the side. They're like, oh, here's where I'm getting my news. Here's some newsletters I like. Here's some blogs I like. That's the blog roll. And we said, what if, we all are trying to break this like podcast discovery problem. And all the solutions that are out there are algorithmically driven. And they all lead towards the platformization of podcasting, where podcasting is on one platform. And it's kind of destroyed the independent nature of podcasting. It becomes more like a social media. So we didn't want that to happen. But we're like, how do we recommend shows? It's still word of mouth. But Podroll would allow any podcaster to say, hey, if you like my show, here's 3 or 4 other shows that I would recommend to you. You already trust me for the 45 minutes that I talk to you once a week. Here's some others if you're into it. And it's really exciting to kind of see shows pop up on one Podroll and then they show up on another, or shows will kind of cross promote. And so if you just pick these shows, they will show up in your Podroll. They'll show up on your podcast website. And over time, we hope that more podcast listening apps will pick these up so that if you're listening inside of your favorite podcasting app, at the bottom, you run out of episodes. It goes, hey, the podcast host is recommending these other shows. Why don't you check one of these out?
Is that what the user, I always think about what the user experience is like. So in apps that recommend shows, is Apple, I guess I don't really stare at what's happening, because sometimes I got my earbuds on and my phone's in my pocket. So I don't really see what's happening from the screen perspective. But when the episode is done, is it Spotify or Apple that would like use the Blogroll tag to recommend apps, or how's that working?
Here's how, in my ideal world, this would work. So Other people working on Podcasting 2.0 would probably have different opinions. But in my ideal world, I want information to get very quickly from the podcast host, the person creating the show, to the listener. And one of those pieces of information is, here are some recommendations. And so using this tag, let's say you're listening to a podcast and it ends. And you go, okay, I've listened to all of my shows. And you open up your podcasting app and it said, hey, looking for new shows? 3 of the podcasts that you regularly listen to recommend Podcast Junkies. Why don't you go and check it out? It was recommended by Alban at Buzzcast. It was recommended by this show. It was recommended by this show. And it's like, the same experience that you might get on Goodreads. I finish a book, I go in and I say, I just finished that book. And it says, you might like this book. And I click it. And it says like 4 of my friends have given it 5-star ratings. I'm like, oh, I don't really want to know what's the best book. The New York Times bestseller isn't always the right one for me. But if I see that like my best friend from college and my dad and somebody else I know from the podcasting industry, like they all liked the same book, well, it's probably pretty good. Those personal recommendations mean so much to me. And so that's how I hope Podroll helps people find more shows that they'd be interested in.
That makes a lot of sense. So I could talk to you about so many, geek out on so much podcasting stuff. I'm trying to think about things that'd be like relatable and helpful for our audience. The one that really comes to mind, and I think this is obviously with everything that's happening with like the gamification of download numbers and people using these like gaming apps now to like get a lot of download numbers. And then what's happening with, is it OP3 or OPM3 or the new like download metric that OP3? So I'm curious like what strides have been made from Buzzsprout's side in terms of like showing metrics that are, or download numbers, and how you're thinking about those. You know, people are like shying away from like even IAB because people are saying, hey, look, what are we paying these annual fees to IAB for? And then the numbers are being gamified anyway. So I'm curious what, as you know, being a podcast host and reporting numbers is a big part of what you do. I'm curious where you guys lie with that.
This has been a problem we've had since 2008. You have people or you have bots that try to download episodes, and it's okay. If you want to download the episode, go for it. But when we see 500 episodes all get downloaded by the exact same person within 2 seconds, and they're on different shows, we go, okay, we know this is a bot. We see a new podcast all of a sudden get 700 downloads, but 698 of them are all on iTunes.
Yeah.
We know that doesn't make sense. No one's using iTunes for podcasts anymore. And because we have over 120,000 active podcasts, we can look across all of them and say, we know what real downloads look like. And we can spot abnormalities. We can spot like aberrations in the statistics and go, okay, let's pinpoint what's happening here. So it has been a, back and forth for 17 years, or really 16 and a half since we launched Buzzsprout, trying to find what kind of things are people doing to game their numbers and then shutting it down for everybody on Buzzsprout. And so there were many years that people would move a show to Buzzsprout and they'd say, oh no, something bad happened. My stats went down. And we'd say it's honestly, it might even be worse, because what we're really telling you is these are real stats. These are legitimate. It's not that we don't see the old downloads that you used to get. It's just we've identified them as bots. So we often end up on the more aggressive side because, sadly, as Tom, one of our co-founders, says, stats always go down as they get more accurate. We never have accidentally filtered out real people who are like a download of the episode. We're often trying to battle the bots that are downloading things. I still think there is value in things like IAB, at least in the guideline that they've created. So what the IAB does is they say, here are some rubric. Here's what should count as a download. And to me, they're kind of the minimum viable. You've got to at least be doing the stuff the IAB has for you. It's not everything, but it's at least a good minimum. And so we always have met those standards. We're planning to be recertified this year and to continue. But we often go well beyond that as we see, especially when money gets attached to it. You just find all sorts of new scams when people are like, oh, they're running ads on their show, and you see something weird happen. Helps us identify all the different ways that people are promoting, whether it be in a gaming app, like you said, or just buying downloads from people who've got 700 different devices to play episodes.
What are you playing with the OP3 numbers? Or because I know people have been saying that's like a really reliable metric in terms of like showing true activity for a show.
Yeah, I think OP3 is a really good check. So John Spurlock is doing the OP3. You can look at it for Buzzcast. All of our stats are public on OP3, and they line up very well with Buzzsprout numbers.
Okay.
If you were anywhere else, you're on another podcast host, I'd recommend you just add OP3 as a prefix, which then you've now got two sources that are telling you, here's what we think the stats for your show are. And OP3, I believe, follows all IAB guidelines, but John's being pretty smart about filtering out bots. So you might find out, hey, good, the stats I always thought were legit, they're legit. But you also might find, oh, it's actually about 3% lower because OP3 was a little bit better at finding some bots that were out there. But it's a really nice thing to set up. It's got lots of nice visualizations for all the stats nerds like us. You can dive in a little bit more and try to learn more about your show.
Where do you go to see your OP3 stats?
OP3.
And if you're listening on the audio version of this episode, this is the part where we're looking stuff up online now.
I don't have the URL. I mean, to set OP3 up, you go to op3.dev.
Okay.
And
I'm wondering if you because if you put the feed into your podcast host, I'm curious where you would see those numbers. We can look it up later. If you want to send it to me later, I'll put it in the show notes. I don't want to
Sure. So if you're asking for the shows for Buzzsprout.
Well, yeah, I'm just saying in general, like if I did put that in your as a prefix, where would I see those numbers captured? Like in Chartable, like if you put a Chartable prefix in, you can go to Chartable and you can see what the activity is there.
Yeah, it's op3.dev.
Okay.
And that's where you go to get the prefix. You'd send that to Buzzsprout. We add it to your show. And then all these numbers start populating in op3.dev. But if you do what we did for Buzzcast, you can also make those numbers public so that everybody could see how your show performs. I really like this for advertisers. I don't think it's uncommon that an advertiser says, hey, I want to advertise on the show. How many downloads do you get?
Yeah.
And those numbers are a bit more ambitious than they are accurate.
Yes.
That's what they would hope the show would get. But if you have publicly...
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the dirty little secret of advertising. Like they're gaming the numbers so they can show the sponsors that they have these big downloads, and then the advertisers are not getting like the results from the campaign, but they're spending all this money. But they're saying like, look, I'll show you my, IAB certified numbers that show you I'm delivering these downloads. But if the majority are coming them from like apps or just other ways that they're getting those 8 seconds of play or whatever the actual metric number. It's an interesting thing, and I think it might get to the point where advertisers start specifically requesting like OP3 like numbers.
Well, if you think about this from the advertiser's perspective or from the podcaster's perspective, downloads are just a stand-in. They're not the real thing. Advertisers want to know, I spend $100 on advertising with your show. I'm going to get like $300 back in sales. And when I look at my margins, that means I make more money than I spend. So they're happy to do it. And all that's happened is they try to guess, they try to figure out a little bit of marketing magic. Okay, 5,000 downloads, probably this percent will actually do something. Oh, the audience looks like this. And they're trying to figure out, all that math. But at the end of the day, they want to know, will I make money? And so it's why all those, codes for MeUndies work. MeUndies in the end is like, we spent $1,000 for this show, and then we got $1,500 of purchases using that MeUndies code. Great. We're happy with it. And for the podcaster, I think this is what we're doing with fan mail. You care that there's 2,000 downloads. Like that's really, really good. Or you even care if there's 50 downloads. But you know what's way cooler than 50 downloads? The one person who tells you, I listened to the show.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because a download's not a listen. People could download it and not listen. And they can listen and not pay attention. They can pay attention and not like it. But if they go all the way to texting you, they liked it.
That's your true fans.
And they listened to it and they paid attention to it. And that's what I'm in podcasting for. So it's trying to get a little bit away from the stat that's not, the most critical. Downloads are not the most critical. Listens aren't. It's people. It's engagement. It's relationships.
Yes.
And if I get 10 texts that say, I enjoy this show, well, then it's great. That's enough for me. I'm so thankful for my 10 listeners who like the show. Now, the other 1,000 that download the show and I didn't hear from, that's a bonus. But the real people who texted, I know for a fact those are real, and I love it. And so that's what I want to get with fan mail. I want to have thousands and thousands of Buzzsprout podcasters every week getting encouragement from their listeners. I love your show. I love what you're doing. Keep it up. It means something to me because those are real relationships that are formed. They mean so much more than stats ever could.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, and I'm glad you're providing that. It's going to be so interesting, and you'll probably be doing reporting on that metric, like 1,000 text messages received by our listeners. The other page that I am always looking for, what's the Buzzsprout link that shows you if your show is doing X number of downloads, it's doing like the 1%, or I always refer to that. And I was like, because podcasters get so discouraged. It's like, I'm only getting 150 downloads. I'm like, well, if you listen to Buzzsprout, then you'll know you're actually doing pretty well. But I always forget what that URL is.
Yeah, it's buzzsprout.com/stats.
Okay. Well, that's obvious. That's an easy one then. Okay.
It only feels obvious in retrospect. What's nice about this is we're aggregating stats from 124,000 active podcasts, over almost 170,000 episodes released last month, over 100 million downloads. And we're telling you, what are the top podcasting apps? One that popped up this week or last month that was really interesting was Spotify has now passed Apple Podcasts, and our data is being the top podcasting app. I think this is because Apple got much more strict about auto downloading episodes. Yeah. So when they made that change, Spotify moved up. What you were referencing is down here at the bottom. So I had the same experience. We would go to conferences and somebody'd say, I think I'm going to quit. I'm like, oh, why? I mean, this is real. This one's real. A lady said, I'm going to quit. And I said, why? She goes, I'm only getting like 15,000 downloads an episode. I was like, 15,000? She goes, yeah. I mean, I've been podcasting for over a month, and that's the most I'm getting on an episode. And I was like, whoa, what did you do? What? And she's like, she's thinking she's failed. And it's blowing my mind. And I'm like, I don't think you understand. You're in the top probably 0.1% of podcasters, at least at your stage. And so we had to put these numbers public. So what we do is if you release an episode, figure out how many downloads it gets in the first 7 days. That's a good idea of how many subscribers there are to your podcast.
Yeah.
If you're getting 30 downloads in the first 7 days, you're in the top half of podcasters. And we're talking out of the 124,000 on Buzzsprout that are active.
It's crazy to think about. Yeah.
You're up there in the top 62,000 already. And if you get 115 downloads, you're in the top quarter. If you're getting 470, you're in the top 10%. And these numbers start feeling so much more doable. If you think I have to grow a show to 470 downloads and now I'm in the top 10%, that feels so much more doable than when you pull up these top shows on Spotify and you see millions of listeners, and then you flip over to your podcast and has 200 and you go, I'm a failure. You're not a failure. You're in the top quarter. You're crushing it. But you're just comparing yourself to somebody who's done it for 15 years and was a celebrity before they ever started.
Of course. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you published those. They're very inspiring to podcasts that just getting started. And it's something I constantly reference and I share with our clients when we launch shows for them. I'm like, slow and steady wins the race. And, just the key is really to get into that 30, then to that 115, and then to that 470 as well.
Yeah, it's really, really powerful, especially when you remember, these are people. I gave a talk once at a meetup, and I think back then the number was 29 was the median. And everyone's talking about, whoa, 29. And I looked around, I counted, and I went, just for reference, there's 29 people in this room. And everyone goes, oh, like 29 feels so tiny when it's a number. But when you look around a room, and it's standing room only now because the room is packed out, even though it had like the tiered seating in it, it felt packed. It was 29. I was like, if every week someone invited me to come give a talk here, but I had to spend 45 minutes to prepare the talk, I would do it every week because it would feel like this is really valuable. 29 people showed up. That's as many as are in an average college classroom. But when it's a podcast, we see a lot of people go, nah, I think I'm just shutting it down. No one really cares. So hopefully this fan mail feature is what really helps a few of those people in the 29 to reach out to their shows and say, you're doing a great job. Keep it up. Here's something you taught me.
Yes, I'm eager to see what the feedback on that's going to be. One last topic I can't have to cover is YouTube. So just real quick, just as we wrap up, like what's your take on, they had that big announcement about like submitting your RSS feed, and I'm sure there's probably a lot of confusion. I'm sure a lot of Buzzsprout clients had questions after that webinar, but what's been the take on what they're doing, Buzzsprout's perspective on YouTube entering or trying to make podcasts more visible?
Well, I love Google. One of the greatest products of all time. I love YouTube. I watch, an ungodly amount of YouTube. There's so much valuable information. I'm trying to replace a water filter on my fridge, and I type it in and there's a YouTube video on it. Like, it's amazing. And you go on there and you see all of these, quote unquote podcasts that are blowing up. They're interview style shows, some of them with celebrities, some of them with sports, some athletes. And it's a blast to watch. And so I think in the podcasting space, we all got very excited. Lots of podcasters were like, well, shoot, what if I just did video as well? I could get way, way bigger.
Yeah.
And I think what a lot of people missed is how difficult video can be. It's really, really hard to do video well. Lighting is like a whole science. It's a job on movies for a reason. Like, it's a big deal. Getting the audio right, getting the videos right, getting the camera angles, recording multiple things, editing that. It's almost an order of magnitude more difficult. So what you see is a lot of people say, I want to be on YouTube, but I don't want to do video. And so the Google podcast team moved over to YouTube Music, and now they have podcasts on YouTube. And what they're doing is they're taking all of that audio content and they're kind of shoving it into YouTube.
Yeah.
But on YouTube, nobody wants to watch a static image and listen to a podcast. They want to do that on their podcasting app. Now, it's nice to have another place that people might listen to your podcast, but I've not seen great numbers from any of this audio content that's showing up on YouTube as really moving any of the numbers. So we support it. Technically we support it. I recommend to anybody who's thinking about podcasting or thinking about doing videos on YouTube, I say, let's pick one thing to do.
Yeah.
If you are passionate about blogging or video or podcasting or social media, those are all good things. But probably pick one. I personally love podcasting the most, and I will advocate for that one because it's personal. It's very low barrier to entry. It feels very authentic. It's the human voice. There's very high engagement. But if you're teaching me how to change the, filter on my refrigerator, the water filter, it's just so much better done on YouTube. And if you're sharing inspirational quotes, it's better over there on Twitter for you to do that.
Yeah.
So find the one that aligns with what you're doing and don't overburden yourself by doing all of it. There's a really wonderful article put out by the podcast host about how YouTube was killing more podcasts than anything ever has. And their logic was a lot of people who would start a podcast go, I'm going to start a podcast. And then they're told, great, but you need to make it a video podcast on YouTube. And they go, okay, so I've got to now learn how to do that. And then somebody else shows up and goes, and you've got to put out shorts because shorts are how it grows. Then you got to get those on TikTok and on Instagram, on YouTube Shorts and on Facebook. And they go, oh, and now it's gotten bigger and bigger. And one weekend they burn out and they go, I've got a full-time job and now I have another full-time job for this podcast that hasn't even started yet. And they shut it down. I'm more excited about start with making one YouTube video or 5 tweets or one podcast episode and let it just grow organically and see, does it, feed your soul and does it do something good for you? And if it does, keep running with it. But don't imagine from day one, I have to have this digital marketing plan that's going to, turn me into some celebrity. It probably is just your personal thing. And so let it be that and let it be okay being that in the beginning.
That's great advice. Probably a great way to put a bow on this conversation. We've covered so much. I think that's been helpful for podcasters, and I think for folks to get a deeper insight into what's happening at Buzzsprout. You guys are so, I feel like you're not bleeding edge, but you're definitely like cutting edge in terms of like implementing and testing out like features and functionality that really, it speaks to the podcast, the heart of the podcasting community. Like I really feel like anytime I hear what you're working on, that you always have the genuine indie podcaster at heart. And so I just really applaud all the work you guys are doing, and you're such a valuable resource and a spokesperson for the community as well. So I just like really want to applaud and support everything you do to support the community.
Well, that means a ton coming from you, Harry. I remember the first time we met, because I knew who you were for years and years before we ever met personally. We were both in a Starbucks at one of these conferences, and I was like, hey,
yeah.
Are you Harry Duran from Podcast Junkies? And you're like, how do you know who I am? So I really appreciate it coming from you.
Yeah. So where's the next conference you're going to be at?
I will be at DC for Podcast Movement. And we are also going to be doing a series of podcast meetups with Podcast Movement. They're going to do one in New York, one in DC, and one in Philadelphia.
That's nice.
Really cool thing for anyone who wants to go to Podcast Movement, but maybe it's cost prohibitive. If you go to any of those meetups, we've sponsored tickets. And so if you go and you've never been to Podcast Movement, you'll get a free Podcast Movement ticket to the big DC event. And that's, $400 or something. So if you're in one of those areas, come out to a meetup. I'll be at all three of those. And everybody can hang out and have a good time, talk podcasting, and then go see each other in DC.
You got to talk to the team to add one more stop in Minneapolis.
The New York, Philadelphia, DC to Minneapolis train. It fits right in.
Yeah, right across. Well, thanks again for your time, Alban. I always appreciate catching up with you, because I know sometimes it's hard at the conferences. We see each other for a couple of minutes and then we're like, oh, we'll catch up at the party. And then we're like, the music is blasting. And it's just like, I just love this opportunity of having this virtual stage where I can bring my friends in and we can just have a proper chat for a nice, decent amount of time just to get the lowdown on what's happening. So I appreciate you making the time again. I know we were trying to make the schedules work, but it's always very interesting to hear your feedback on what's happening in the community. So where's the best place you want to point people to learn more about you and Buzzsprout?
You can go to buzzsprout.com. If you want to learn more about Buzzsprout, you go to any of the links we talked about. If you want to see the stats or you want to see some of these features that we've launched. And if you have any feedback for me specifically, reach out on Twitter at Alban Brooke. Or if you go to Buzzcast, my podcast, you can click the link in the show notes and send us some fan mail and let us know what you think of that feature. Let us know what you think about anything that Harry and I talked about on this episode. I'd love to hear it.
Very cool. I'll have to check that out and send you some feedback. All right. Thanks again, my friend. I really appreciate it.
Take care.